Welcome, and thank you for joining us for Royal Scandals They Tried to Hide, the love affairs of medieval kings. In this series, we step behind the curtain of power to uncover the secret affairs, forbidden loves, and dangerous desires that shaped the fate of kings and sometimes destroyed entire kingdoms. These are not the tales told in official chronicles or school books. These are the whispers behind the throne, the shadows in the royal bedchambers, and the truths history tried to bury. Have you ever wondered what lies behind a crown? Not the jewels, not the ceremonies, but what truly lies beneath it, the burden, the fear, the loneliness. What does it mean to be a man forbidden from loving freely, trapped in alliances sealed before he could walk, bound to a woman he did not choose, while his heart longs elsewhere? Medieval kings were many things: commanders, lawmakers, symbols of divine authority. But above all, they were human, and like any human, they felt desire. They fell in love. They made mistakes. But unlike us, their mistakes could spark wars, bring down dynasties, or end in execution. To love, for a king, was never simple. It was never safe. When a monarch fell for the wrong person, history didn't always record it, not openly. Instead, it left cryptic lines in dusty scrolls. The queen was dismissed under unclear circumstances. A nobleman was executed for treason, though his crimes were never detailed. A civil war broke out, source unknown. But behind those lines, there was always a story, a glance, a forbidden letter, a meeting that never should have happened, and sometimes a corpse. Love was rarely romantic in the medieval courts. It was political. It was weaponized. It was feared. And yet, there were those rare moments when a king dared to love without calculation, when he followed his heart rather than his advisors, when he placed the crown second and a woman, or a man, first. Those moments were beautiful and catastrophic. Some of those lovers vanished without a trace. No grave, no title, no portrait left behind. But sometimes, centuries later, a name emerges, a lover remembered in a servant's diary, a figure hidden in the background of an old tapestry, a line of poetry written in a language no one dared to speak aloud at court. These are not fairy tales. These are tragedies. These are warnings, because when kings fall in love, someone always pays the price. Most often, it was the women who suffered, married off as pawns in political games, traded like assets, used as symbols of peace between rival nations. Some were imprisoned, poisoned, or humiliated for falling for the wrong man, or worse, for inspiring a king to fall for them. Others played the game to survive. Some of the king's mistresses became the most powerful figures in the realm, not by title, but by influence. They whispered in his ear when no one else could. They made and unmade laws behind velvet curtains. Some ruled empires in all but name, but even they were never truly safe. A single rumor could be fatal. A noblewoman, once the favorite, could become a traitor overnight if the king's gaze shifted. One misplaced letter, one jealous rival, one political shift, and everything they'd built would turn to dust. And still, love persisted, even in the coldest castles, behind the most guarded walls. Hearts beat with longing, and when love was real, unguarded, unplanned, it was all the more dangerous, because true love in a royal court was an act of rebellion. What makes these stories so haunting is how familiar they feel. We recognize the heartbreak, the jealousy, the secret meetings, the desperate promises, the hopeless goodbyes. These kings, crowned and cloaked in divine authority, were no different from us when they fell in love, except for one thing: they had everything to lose. They couldn't just break up, walk away, or start over. A single affair could cost them the trust of their nobles, the support of the church, or the loyalty of an army. It could start a war, force a marriage, or end in a public execution. Love, in these courts, was like fire in a thatched roof. Once it caught, it could burn the entire house down. And yet, some still dared. Some risked everything to be with the one they chose, and others, in loving wrongly, doomed themselves and everyone around them. These are stories not told in official chronicles, but they are not gone. They live on in ghost stories of haunted castles, in letters sealed with broken wax, in portraits where a royal hand rests just a little too intimately on a shoulder it shouldn't touch. Now, the crowns are gone, the thrones are empty, the castles are ruins, but their love stories, hidden, forbidden, tragic, still echo through time. And today, we begin to tell them, not to shame, not to gossip, but to understand, to see that even the most powerful men in history were, in the end, ruled not just by thrones, but by hearts. It began with a crown already too heavy and a heart already torn. In the early 14th century, King Edward II of England stood at the center of a realm already trembling. His father, Edward IV, known as Longshanks, had been a warrior king, a hammer to his enemies, a man of iron and ice. But Edward II was different. He loved music. He preferred festivals to battlefields. And most dangerously of all, he loved a man. That man was Piers Gaveston. Their story didn't begin in scandal. Not at first. Gaveston was a knight of Gascon origin, intelligent, charismatic, and confident in ways that made nobles uneasy. He and Edward met as teenagers, and whatever the nature of their bond in those early years, it was clear to all that they were inseparable. Edward gave him everything: titles, land, wealth. He made Gaveston Earl of Cornwall, a rank typically reserved for members of the royal family. He placed him at his side in all ceremonies and even referred to him in private as his brother, though many whispered another word entirely: lover. When Edward became king, he didn't crown Gaveston, but he might as well have. He raised him to heights that infuriated the powerful barons of England. At the coronation, Gaveston was dressed in royal silks, leading the proceedings with arrogance and flair. The Queen, Isabella of France, was humiliated. The nobles were outraged, and the court, once a place of rigid protocol, became a playground for Edward and his favorite. But this was no fairy tale. It was a fuse slowly burning toward catastrophe. The nobles saw Gaveston as a threat, not just to tradition, but to their influence. He mocked them openly, gave them cruel nicknames, and made decisions they believed should belong to the king alone. For Isabella, the queen, it was worse. She was the daughter of the King of France, married off for alliance, but on her wedding night, it was Gaveston who stood closest to Edward. In private and in public, she was pushed aside, and she never forgot it. Over the next few years, tension exploded into confrontation. The barons forced Edward to exile Gaveston, not once, but multiple times. Each time, Edward wept, resisted, and then brought him back in secret. Their bond seemed unbreakable, but the realm had reached its limit. In 1312, a group of nobles captured Gaveston. They promised a fair trial. They gave none. He was dragged from sanctuary and executed, beheaded on a remote hillside. His body was left for days before it was buried. Edward was shattered. He kept Gaveston's memory alive, obsessively. For months, he refused to attend court. He neglected his queen. He visited the place where peers died again and again, and he made enemies of everyone who had touched the man he loved. But grief turned to rage, and rage to recklessness. Over the next decade, Edward's rule spiraled. He surrounded himself with new favorites, men like Hugh Despenser, ruthless and hungry for power. The nobles rebelled again, and this time the queen herself would not stand aside. Isabella, once the neglected young bride, now became the orchestrator of her husband's downfall. She allied with Roger Mortimer, a powerful lord, and her rumored lover. Together, they launched an invasion from France. Edward, betrayed by his own court, fled with Despenser, but they were captured, humiliated, and paraded through the streets. Despenser was tortured and executed. Edward suffered a stranger fate. He was imprisoned, dethroned, forced to hand his crown to his own son. Then, one night, he disappeared. Some say he was murdered in the most grotesque of ways. Others believe he escaped and lived out his final years in exile, broken and anonymous. But what history does not debate is this: his love for Gaveston reshaped a kingdom. It fractured the nobility. It soured his marriage. It led to a queen's rebellion, a lover's death, and the first successful deposition of an English king in centuries. To some, Edward II was a weak monarch undone by obsession. To others, he was a man born in the wrong age, where loving freely was treason and softness was fatal. What is certain is that in trying to protect the man he loved, he lost everything else. This wasn't just scandal, it was tragedy, and it was far from the only one, because across the channel, another monarch's heart would soon lead him into even darker waters. The night Paris trembled, it wasn't because of war, it was because of whispers. In the year 1314, the Kingdom of France stood at the height of its power. King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, ruled with absolute authority. He was cold, ruthless, and politically brilliant. Under his command, the monarchy had grown stronger than ever before. The church was weakened, the Templars had been crushed, and the crown gleamed brighter than ever. But inside the Louvre, then a royal fortress, not a museum, something was rotting. Philip had 3 sons, Louis, Philip, and Charles. Each was a prince of the blood, destined to become king, and each was married. Their wives were not ordinary women. They were princesses, daughters of powerful lords, strategically selected to strengthen alliances. The court was watched carefully. Every movement was noted. Every whisper carried weight. And yet, somehow, scandal still bloomed. It began with Queen Isabella of England, the daughter of King Philip IV. She had married Edward II of England. Yes, the same Edward whose tragic love for Piers Gaveston had torn his kingdom apart. But Isabella was no fragile queen. She was observant, intelligent, dangerous in silence. During a visit to Paris, Isabella brought with her a gift for her brothers, embroidered coin purses, but sometime later, she noticed the purses, those very specific handmade gifts, appearing on the belts of two knights at court, the D'Aulnay brothers, Gautier and Philippe, handsome, bold, and disturbingly close to her sisters-in-law. It could have been coincidence. It could have meant nothing. But Isabella said nothing and watched. She began noticing strange behaviors, secret meetings, laughter behind closed doors, cloaks exchanged in hallways, and more than once she saw her sisters-in-law, Margaret and Blanche, pass messages to the D'Aulnay knights in ways that were just a little too careful. So, when she returned to England, she whispered her suspicions to her father. And that was all it took. Philip IV did not tolerate threats, especially not within his own family. A sudden investigation was launched. The Louvre became a prison. Servants were interrogated. Guards followed the princesses like shadows. What they uncovered was not just rumor. It was treason. Margaret and Blanche, both daughters-in-law of the king, were accused of adultery, not with noblemen, not with foreign agents, but with common knights, with men beneath their station, men who had no right to even look at them. Their alleged lovers, the D'Aulnay brothers, were arrested. Under torture, they confessed. Whether the confession was true or not ceased to matter. Their punishment was designed to send a message. They were flayed alive, their genitals cut off, their bodies broken and displayed in public, left to rot before the gates of Paris. As for the princesses, Margaret, the wife of Louis, was imprisoned in a cold tower. No trial, no mercy. Her hair was shaved, her gowns stripped. She died there not long after. Some say from illness, others from exposure, and some believe by poison. Blanche, the wife of Charles, shared a similar fate. Imprisoned, disgraced, never again allowed to see her children, never spoken of in court except as a cautionary tale. And Joan, the third sister-in-law, was also accused but spared imprisonment. Why? She was the sister of the powerful Duke of Burgundy. Politics protected her, but her reputation never recovered. What made this scandal so terrifying wasn't just the affair. It was the implication. These women were not just royal wives. They were vessels for royal blood. If they had lovers, then whose child was truly royal? Could a bastard one day sit on the throne? The idea was unthinkable, and yet, once whispered, it could not be unwhispered. The affair destroyed the trust within the royal family. It humiliated the French crown at a time when it was most powerful. Philip IV, the Iron King, was so shaken by the scandal that he died the same year. Some say from a stroke, others say from the sheer weight of dishonor. And what followed? Louis, his eldest son, became king, but his wife, Margaret, was already dead. He remarried hastily, but died a year later under mysterious circumstances. Philip, the second son, ruled briefly, but never fully escaped the shadow of the scandal. And Charles, the youngest, took the throne last, without an heir. 3 sons, 3 kings, no lasting legacy, and with that, the Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for over 300 years, collapsed, all because of a few kisses behind closed doors, a few careless purses, a few whispers carried across the wrong lips. This affair would ripple far beyond Paris. It would inspire novels, historians, and centuries later, it would become the opening tragedy of Maurice Drouin's The Accursed Kings, a series that George R. Martin called the original Game of Thrones. But it wasn't fiction. It was painfully, brutally real. And it reminds us, the higher the bloodline, the sharper the blade of shame. In medieval courts, love was not a gift. It was a liability. It could bring queens to their knees. It could end dynasties. And sometimes, just sometimes, it could end an entire age. In the scorched heart of medieval Castile, where olive trees cast shadows on a blood-red soil and cathedrals rose like promises from dust, a king looked down from his palace window, not at the court, not at his generals, but at a woman. Her name was Leonor de Guzman, and the moment King Alfonso X saw her, nothing, nothing, was ever the same again. Alfonso was not a weak king. In fact, he was everything a medieval ruler was expected to be: powerful, feared, victorious in war. He had led armies against the Moors, expanded his kingdom's reach, and kept the volatile nobility of Castile under tight control. He was young, charismatic, and already a legend by the time he turned 25. But he was also married. His queen, Maria of Portugal, was a political bride. Their union had been sealed in diplomacy, not affection. She was the daughter of the King of Portugal, delicate alliance that held the fragile peace between two stubborn nations. Maria was virtuous, obedient, and deeply religious. She was everything the church wanted in a queen. But she was not Leonor. Leonor de Guzman came from nobility, but not royalty. She was intelligent, bold, and strikingly beautiful. Not the passive flower expected in a royal mistress, but a woman of steel wrapped in silk. When Alfonso first met her, the attraction was instant. But more than that, she listened to him. She challenged him. She spoke like someone who did not fear a king. And Alfonso, who had been raised in a court full of flatterers and yes-men, found her presence intoxicating. He did not simply make her his mistress. He made her his shadow queen. For nearly 2 decades, while Maria wore the crown, it was Leonor who held the king's heart. She bore him 10 children. Yes, 10. All acknowledged, all legitimized, in name and wealth. Alfonso built her palaces. He gave her lands. He surrounded her with guards and servants, usually reserved for royalty. In court, she was treated with deference. When she spoke, nobles listened. And Queen Maria, she was forgotten, isolated in her chambers, ignored in ceremonies. Her own servants were gradually reassigned to Leonore's household. She watched from the fringes as her husband built an empire around another woman. But queens do not forget, and queens do not forgive. For years, Maria bore the humiliation with silence. She prayed, she waited, but inside, resentment was blooming, not just at the betrayal of her marriage, but at the threat Leonore posed to her son, because Maria had one child, Pedro, and Leonore. She had 10. In any other court, the king's bastards would have been hidden or cast aside. But Alfonso broke all precedent. He loved his children with Leonore. He educated them, knighted them, prepared them for roles in court and military life. One of them, Enrique, stood out in particular. Intelligent, charismatic, a natural leader, and dangerously close to the throne. Maria saw it clearly. If Alfonso died, Leonore's son might try to seize the crown from Pedro. The Queen's bloodline, the entire Portuguese alliance, could be shattered. Everything she'd suffered in silence could be swept away in a single move. But fate intervened before politics could. In 1350, during a campaign in Gibraltar, King Alfonso XV contracted the plague. Within days, he was dead, and everything he had built, his victories, his peace, his court centered on Leonore, collapsed. The moment the crown passed to Pedro, Queen Maria struck. No longer the silent queen, she seized the reins of power. She summoned her son, now King Pedro I of Castile, and demanded he take control. Leonore, once untouchable, was suddenly vulnerable. Maria had waited 15 years for this. She had Leonore arrested, dragged from her estate, stripped of her titles, humiliated before the very nobles who once bowed to her. She was sent to a convent, then transferred to secret prisons. Her sons begged for her release. Some nobles argued for mercy, but Queen Maria refused. 2 years later, in 1351, Leonor de Guzman was executed, quietly, without trial, in a remote fortress. Some said Maria gave the order herself. Pedro, the new king, had done nothing to stop it. But that silence would cost him everything, because Leonor's sons did not forget, especially one, Enrique of Trastamara, half-brother to Pedro, bastard by law, warrior by blood. Enrique believed he had the right to rule, not just for himself, but to avenge the death of the mother who had raised him as a prince while the queen schemed in shadows. Over the next 20 years, Enrique would gather support from nobles, from Aragon, from France. Civil war tore Castile apart. Brother fought brother. Castles burned. The crown slipped from hand to hand like a cursed relic. And Pedro, who had once watched his mother destroy his father's mistress, became a tyrant. They called him Pedro the Cruel. Historians debate whether the title was fair, but what is certain is this: his paranoia grew, his executions multiplied, and his enemies circled like wolves. In 1369, at the Battle of Montiel, Pedro was betrayed by one of his own men, captured, brought before Enrique. There was no mercy. Enrique personally stabbed him to death in his tent. And with that, the bastard son of a royal mistress, Leonor's son, became King Enrique II of Castile, a crown soaked in the blood of two women, one who had been ignored and one who had dared to be loved too much. The dynasty shifted, the court changed, but the scars remained. All of it, 20 years of war, the death of a king, the fall of a queen, began with one forbidden love. Leonor de Guzman had no throne, no title, no royal marriage, but her influence reshaped a kingdom. She loved a king, and in doing so, she birthed both a dynasty and a war. In the heart of 14th century France, where chivalry and courtly love intertwined with deadly ambition, King John II, known to history as John the Good, ruled a kingdom both proud and fragile. His reign was marked by war and tragedy, but none cut deeper than the scandal that blossomed within the stone walls of his royal palace. John was a man forged in battle, a king who had worn the crown since 1350 amid the Hundred Years' War with England. He was noble, imposing, and fiercely loyal to the ideals of knighthood. But even the strongest steel can bend under the weight of desire. That desire came in the form of Agnes Sorel. Agnes was no ordinary woman. Born to a minor noble family, she possessed a rare beauty that seemed to glow like sunlight caught in a jeweled goblet. Her hair was golden, her eyes bright, and her presence commanded attention wherever she went. But what truly set Agnes apart was her intelligence and boldness, a woman who did not shrink beneath the court's judgment, but met it head on with wit and charm. John met Agnes in the early 1440s, when she was in her early 20s. The court buzzed with rumors almost immediately. Unlike many royal mistresses who lurked in shadows, Agnes stepped into the light. She was openly recognized as the king's favorite, attending court events with an elegance that rivaled Queen's. Some whispered she was the first official royal mistress in French history, a title that seemed to elevate her beyond mere scandal. John was smitten. He lavished her with gifts, jewels, lands, palaces. He even created a new title for her, Dame de Beauté, Lady of Beauty. Their relationship was not hidden, it was celebrated, causing scandal among the nobility and clergy alike. But Agnes's influence extended far beyond the king's heart. She became a political force, advising John on matters of state, and even influencing appointments at court. Some nobles resented her power, accusing her of manipulating the king. Others admired her for bringing a breath of life into a court weighed down by war and loss. Yet the greatest shock was yet to come. John's wife, Queen Joan Rufert of Auvergne, was a dignified woman of royal blood. She accepted her role as queen with grace, but was powerless against Agnes's hold over her husband. Joan's children watched from the sidelines as Agnes took a place near the throne that rivaled their mother's. The scandal deepened when Agnes gave birth to John's children, two daughters who were openly acknowledged. Unlike many royal bastards, hidden away, Agnes's daughters were welcomed at court, given titles, and raised alongside the king's legitimate heirs. This blatant favoritism enraged the church and conservative nobles. Many sermons from pulpits condemned the king's sinful indulgence, warning that such favoritism threatened the sanctity of royal blood and the moral order of France. But the scandal was not just about love or favoritism, it was about power. Agnes was not content to be merely a mistress. She wielded influence that some said rivaled the queen herself. She orchestrated alliances, brokered deals, and shaped the future of the kingdom behind the scenes. And with the Hundred Years' War raging, such influence was both a blessing and a curse. John's reign was already destabilized by war losses and political unrest. The English had captured his son, the Dauphin Charles, at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, forcing France into uneasy truces and massive ransoms. The kingdom teetered on the brink of collapse. In this chaos, Agnes's presence offered a semblance of stability to the king. She was his confidant, his solace amid defeat and betrayal. But that comfort came at a price. Noble factions conspired to remove her from court. They accused Agnes of witchcraft, of corrupting the king's judgment, even of poisoning rivals. The queen herself is rumored to have confronted Agnes in private, warning her that her days were numbered. But Agnes was undeterred. She held her ground, backed by the king's unwavering favor. Tragically, Agnes's life ended suddenly in 1450. Some say she died of complications following childbirth. Others whisper darker tales of poisoning orchestrated by jealous nobles or the queen's supporters. Her death left the king devastated. For years after, John wore black in mourning and refused to remarry. He spoke openly of her as the love of his life, a beacon in the darkest days. Yet the scandal of Agnes Sorel endured. Her daughters continued to play roles in court politics, and her legacy shaped perceptions of royal mistresses for centuries to come. Agnes's story was a turning point, a moment when love, scandal, and power collided so publicly that it forever changed the nature of monarchy in France. She was no mere mistress. She was a queen in all but name, and her affair with John the Good remains one of the most captivating and complex royal scandals of the medieval era, a vivid reminder that behind the throne, love was a weapon as powerful as any sword. The air was thick with intrigue in the court of England during the late 14th century. The reign of King Richard II was marked by youthful arrogance, political upheaval, and the kind of scandal that could shake even the most fortified castles. At the center of the storm was a woman named Alice Perrers, a name whispered in corridors, feared by nobles, and loathed by queens. Alice came from humble beginnings, a lady in waiting with no noble blood, but what she lacked in pedigree, she made up for in cunning and ambition. She was beautiful, witty, and possessed an uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous waters of the English court. Richard II ascended the throne as a boy, and as he grew into manhood, it became clear that he was a king who craved companionship and counsel beyond the traditional bounds of royalty. He found both in Alice Perrers, who quickly became his favorite, and scandalously, his mistress. Unlike the discreet relationships of the past, their liaison was brazen and public. Alice's influence over Richard was unprecedented. She was seen at his side in the great halls, dressed in finery that rivaled the queen's own. The king showered her with gifts, estates, and titles, elevating her from a mere attendant to a woman of power. The nobles seethed. They saw Alice not only as a threat to the queen, but as a manipulator who bent the king's will for her own gain. Their resentment was so fierce, it sparked factional strife that rippled through the court. But what made this scandal so combustible was not just Alice's rise, but her direct role in government affairs. She was said to have influenced royal decrees, swayed judges, and even controlled access to the king. Her enemies labeled her the Wicked Witch who corrupted the crown. Her power reached such heights that in 1392 a parliamentary session was convened specifically to curb her influence. The so-called Merciless Parliament demanded she be banished from court and stripped of her lands. The king, however, resisted fiercely, demonstrating how deeply he was entangled in her spell. The queen, Anne of Bohemia, was notably distant and politically powerless, often overshadowed by Alice's prominence. Rumors swirled that Anne and Alice despised one another bitterly, but Anne's gentle demeanor left her no match for the mistress's aggressive hold on Richard. The affair was a stark departure from the earlier medieval notion of discreet royal mistresses. It was public, brazen, and politically charged. Alice Perrers's story illustrates how a mistress could become a de facto ruler behind the throne, wielding influence with a mix of charm and ruthless pragmatism. However, scandal has a way of turning tides. When Richard II was deposed in 1399 by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Alice's fortunes rapidly declined. The new regime sought to erase her power, confiscating her estates and banishing her to obscurity. Yet, her story did not end there. She continued to fight to regain her position until her death around 1400. Alice Perrers's life encapsulates the perilous dance of power, desire, and betrayal at the highest levels of medieval England. Her scandal was not just about forbidden love, but about what happens when that love morphs into political dominance. Her legacy is a testament to the fact that in the medieval court, love affairs were never just private, they were deadly politics in disguise. The icy winds swept through the Scottish Highlands as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, casting long shadows over the ancient stone castles. It was in this rugged and unforgiving landscape that one of the most tragic and passionate royal love affairs of medieval Britain unfolded between King Robert the Bruce and Elizabeth de Burgh. Robert the Bruce was no ordinary monarch. Born into nobility, but a warrior at heart, he was a man forged in battle and betrayal. His rise to the throne of Scotland was marked by struggle against both English invaders and internal rivals who sought to claim the crown for themselves. His reign would ultimately define Scotland's fight for independence in the early 14th century. But behind the war cries and battles was a deeply personal story of love, loyalty, and heartbreak. Elizabeth de Burgh was the daughter of an Anglo-Norman noble family known for her grace and intelligence. Unlike the fiery warriors of the age, Elizabeth was a quiet force, steadfast, loyal, and fiercely devoted to her husband. Their marriage was arranged when Robert was still a young nobleman, but what began as a political alliance blossomed into a profound and enduring bond. Their union, however, was anything but peaceful. Robert's path to kingship was riddled with danger. For years, he fought to reclaim Scotland's freedom from English domination. During this turbulent time, Elizabeth was often left vulnerable, caught between the brutal tides of war and the shifting loyalties of Scottish clans. Yet, she never wavered in her support for Robert. Their love was tested when Robert was forced into hiding after his defeat at the Battle of Methven in 1306. Fleeing from English forces, he became a fugitive, while Elizabeth was captured by the English and imprisoned in harsh conditions. She was held for years in various castles, enduring isolation and uncertainty, all while Robert fought tirelessly to reclaim his throne. Despite the physical distance and dangers, letters passed between them, revealing a deep affection and unbreakable commitment. Elizabeth's captivity was used by the English as leverage against Robert, but it only strengthened his resolve. Her suffering became a symbol of Scottish endurance, rallying support for his cause. In 1314, Robert achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Bannockburn, securing Scotland's independence and cementing his place as a national hero. Yet, his first thoughts were not of triumph, but of Elizabeth. Still held captive and suffering, her release was finally negotiated as part of the peace agreements, and when they were reunited, it was said to be a moment of pure joy amid years of hardship. But their story did not end with victory. Elizabeth's health, weakened by years of imprisonment, declined steadily. She bore Robert several children, but the strain of their turbulent life took a toll. She died in 1327, a loss that devastated Robert and cast a shadow over his remaining years. Their love story became legend, not for scandal or betrayal, but for its steadfastness in the face of overwhelming adversity. It was a union that showed the human cost of medieval power struggles and the enduring strength of love. Yet, there was another, darker side to Robert's personal life. Despite his devotion to Elizabeth, Robert fathered several illegitimate children. These offspring were acknowledged and given lands, a common practice for kings seeking to secure loyalty and alliances. But these children also complicated the succession and stirred tensions among the nobility. One of Robert's most notorious illegitimate sons, Thomas Bruce, became embroiled in plots against the crown and was executed for treason. The king's personal life, much like his political one, was marked by conflict and heartbreak. This juxtaposition of love and betrayal, loyalty and ambition, paints a vivid portrait of medieval monarchy, where personal relationships were inseparable from the fate of nations. The story of Robert the Bruce and Elizabeth de Burgh is a powerful reminder that behind the grandeur of crowns and castles, the medieval king's greatest battles were often fought in the chambers of the heart. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the grand stone hall of the Kingdom of Naples. It was the late 14th century, and the air was thick with intrigue, whispers, and the intoxicating scent of forbidden desire. At the heart of this swirling drama was Queen Joanna Fampurser of Naples, a woman whose life was as scandalous and turbulent as the kingdom she ruled. Joanna was no ordinary queen. She inherited the throne in 1343 at just 18 years old, a young woman thrust into power in a male-dominated world. But Joanna was not content to be a mere figurehead. She was intelligent, charismatic, and fiercely independent. Her reign was marked by political upheaval, betrayals, and one of the most notorious scandals of the medieval era, a scandal that would stain her legacy for centuries. Joanna's personal life was a web of passion, politics, and peril. She was married 3 times, but it was her relationships outside of marriage that captured the imagination of contemporaries and historians alike. The most infamous was her love affair with Raimondo di Sangro, a nobleman whose charm and ambition matched her own. Their relationship was unconventional and daring. In a time when queens were expected to produce heirs and uphold alliances through marriage, Joanna defied norms by openly favoring her lovers and involving them in state affairs. Raimondo was not just a lover, he became her closest advisor and confidant, wielding influence that many nobles found scandalous. This intimacy did not go unnoticed. Rumors spread like wildfire through the courts of Europe, whispers of secret meetings, midnight rendezvous, and intrigues that threatened the very fabric of Neapolitan society. The Church, ever watchful of morality, condemned Joanna's behavior, branding her a sinner and a heretic. Yet, the Queen remained defiant, asserting her right to rule and love on her own terms. Joanna's reign was also marked by tragedy. Her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, was murdered under mysterious circumstances shortly after their wedding. Suspicion fell on Joanna herself, although nothing was ever proven. This event cast a dark shadow over her reign and intensified the court's hostility towards her lovers, especially Raimondo. Despite the scandal, Joanna's political acumen kept her on the throne. She navigated alliances, rebellions, and papal pressures with a mix of cunning and courage. But her personal life continually undermined her authority. Nobles used her love affairs as ammunition to question her legitimacy and to rally opposition. Her open defiance of traditional gender roles and courtly expectations made her a lightning rod for controversy. Yet, Joanna's story also reveals the double standards of medieval society. A queen could be vilified for acts that male monarchs often got away with. In 1382, Joanna faced one of the greatest challenges of her reign when Charles of Durazzo, a rival claimant to the throne, invaded Naples with papal support. She was captured and imprisoned, accused of witchcraft and heresy, charges likely motivated as much by politics as by genuine belief. Joanna's downfall was as dramatic as her reign. She died in captivity under suspicious circumstances in 1382, but rumors of assassination and foul play persisted for decades. Her legacy is a complex tapestry of power, passion, and peril, a vivid example of how love affairs could become deadly scandals in the medieval courts. Joanna, Eye of Naples, was a queen who dared to love freely and rule fiercely, but in doing so, she courted both devotion and destruction. Her story remains a haunting testament to the precarious balance between the personal and the political in royal life, where love could be as dangerous as a sword and the throne as fragile as a whispered secret. The halls of the Kingdom of Castile were alive with music, laughter, and the subtle undercurrents of court intrigue. It was the late 14th century, and King Henry II, known as Henry of Trastamara, ruled a realm scarred by civil war but eager for peace. Yet, behind the polished facade of his reign, there simmered a scandal that would shake the foundations of his dynasty and echo through the generations. Henry II was a man forged in conflict, born the illegitimate son of King Alfonso V of Castile. His claim to the throne was contentious, marked by rebellion against his half-brother, King Peter I. After years of warfare, Henry finally seized power in 1369, founding the Trastamara dynasty. But the price of his victory was steep, and his personal life was as tumultuous as his ascent. At the heart of the scandal was his mistress, Juana de Padilla, a woman whose beauty and ambition made her both beloved and feared. Juana was not of noble birth, but her intelligence and charm captivated the king. Their affair was passionate, and unlike many secret liaisons, known throughout the court, causing ripples of gossip and resentment. Juana bore Henry several children, legitimized by the king's decree and granted titles, but their presence challenged the legitimacy of Henry's queen and heirs. This led to bitter factionalism within the court, as nobles aligned themselves with either the queen's faction or Juana's supporters. The queen, Juana Manuel, was a figure of dignity and strength, but she was often overshadowed by the scandal surrounding her husband's infidelities. Unlike many queens who sought to confront rivals openly, Juana Manuel adopted a more restrained approach, focusing on securing the future of her legitimate children. But the tension between the royal family and the king's illegitimate offspring was not merely a matter of personal grievances. It was a political powder keg. The children of Juana de Padilla grew up with significant power and land, their influence threatening to divide the kingdom. One of Henry's illegitimate sons, Enrique de Trastamara, played a pivotal role in Castilian politics, later becoming King Henry III. His rise was complicated by his status, but the king's recognition gave him a foothold in the volatile world of medieval succession. This scandal was emblematic of a broader medieval reality. Royal mistresses were not just figures of desire, but key players in the political chess game. Their children could be pawns or kings. Their alliances could make or break factions. Henry II's relationship with Juana de Padilla also reveals the delicate balance a monarch had to maintain between personal desire and political necessity. Public acknowledgement of a mistress and her children risked alienating powerful nobles and the church, but secrecy could breed distrust and rebellion. Throughout Henry's reign, the scandal simmered beneath the surface, a constant reminder of the fragility of royal authority. It was a dance of appearances and whispered threats, where love and power intertwined dangerously. Henry's death in 1379 left the kingdom at a crossroads. His heirs, legitimate and illegitimate, would continue to shape the fate of Castile. The scandal of his love affairs was never fully resolved. It lingered like a shadow over the dynasty. But beyond the political ramifications, the story of Henry II and Juana de Padilla is a deeply human one. It speaks to the complexities of love and loyalty in a world where every personal relationship was politicized, where a king's heart could sway the fate of nations. This scandal also highlights the gender dynamics of medieval courts. While kings openly maintained mistresses, queens were often powerless to stop them, their dignity and influence constrained by social norms. Yet, these women, both queens and mistresses, were crucial figures in the unfolding drama of power. The tale of Henry II and Juana de Padilla is a vivid chapter in the history of medieval royalty. a reminder that behind the crown and scepter were flawed, passionate people whose choices could ignite scandal or secure legacy. The year was 1464, and the court of England was poised on the edge of transformation. The War of the Roses, a brutal dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York, had already plunged the kingdom into chaos. Blood had been spilled on battlefields from Towton to St. Albans. Crowns had changed heads, and in the midst of this political upheaval, a love story was about to unfold that would send shockwaves through all of Europe. This is the scandalous tale of King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, a union born not of alliance or diplomacy, but of secret passion. Edward IV was tall, handsome, and magnetic, a soldier king whose victories had brought him the crown of England at just 19 years old. He was the embodiment of Plantagenet glory, with golden hair, charm in abundance, and the iron will of a conqueror. Women adored him, men followed him, nobles feared and respected him. But even kings, even those forged in fire and battle, are vulnerable to love, or something very much like it. Elizabeth Woodville was a widow of modest nobility. She was beautiful, poised, and proud. Her first husband, Sir John Grey, had died fighting for the Lancastrian cause, making Elizabeth a symbol of the opposing side. She had 2 young sons and little political protection. By all medieval logic, she should have faded quietly into obscurity. Instead, she captivated the king. The legend goes that Elizabeth waited under a tree to petition Edward for the restoration of her son's inheritance. She pleaded her case not with noble titles or family influence, but with the power of her presence. The meeting may have been carefully arranged by her ambitious relatives, or it may have been fate, but what followed changed history. Edward, used to taking what he wanted, desired Elizabeth, and for the first time, he was refused. Unlike the many noble women who melted under the attention of the young king, Elizabeth said no. Whether out of honor, pride, or strategy, she resisted him, and in doing so, she became irresistible. Within months, they were married, in secret. No pomp, no political theater, just a private ceremony, likely held at Grafton Manor in May 1464. It was a stunning breach of royal tradition. The King of England had married a commoner, a widow, and the daughter of a minor noble house without a dowry or foreign alliance to her name. The court was stunned. When Edward finally revealed the truth later that year, the reaction was explosive. His chief advisor and cousin, the powerful Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, had been negotiating a royal marriage to a French princess. That match would have strengthened Edward's position abroad and helped secure the fragile peace at home. Now, it was shattered. Warwick was furious. Not only had he been publicly humiliated, but the king's reckless choice threatened to undo years of delicate diplomacy. He saw Elizabeth as a schemer, and her family, the Woodvilles, as grasping social climbers. And to be fair, they were. The Queen's relatives were rapidly elevated to positions of power. Her father, mother, brothers, and even cousins were granted titles, marriages, and lands. The court soon groaned under the weight of Woodville ambition. Older noble families, particularly those who had supported Edward during the wars, were incensed. It was not just a marriage, it was a political revolution. Elizabeth herself was no passive figure. She was intelligent, calculating, and politically astute. She knew what her marriage meant and worked swiftly to strengthen her family's influence. But she also faced intense scrutiny, hostility, and open resentment from the nobility. To many, she was an interloper, a commoner who had bewitched the king and thrown the court into disarray. The scandal deepened further in 1469 when Warwick, disillusioned and embittered, turned against Edward, aligning himself with Edward's own brother George, Duke of Clarence. Warwick launched a rebellion. For a time, he succeeded, capturing the king and executing some of the queen's relatives. It was a warning. Edward's marriage had not only cost him allies, it had nearly cost him his throne. But Edward was nothing if not resilient. He regained control, crushed the rebellion, and reasserted his authority. His love for Elizabeth never wavered. She bore him 10 children, including the ill-fated princes in the Tower. Their relationship endured assassination plots, political exile, and the constant threat of civil war. And yet, the consequences of Edward's choice would echo long after his death. In 1483, when Edward died suddenly at just 40 years old, the succession passed to his 12-year-old son, Edward V. Elizabeth. Now the Dowager Queen sought to secure power for her son and for herself. But Edward's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had other plans. Richard seized the young king and placed him, along with his brother, Richard, Duke of York, in the Tower of London. He declared Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth invalid, claiming that Edward had been pre-contracted to marry another woman. If true, that meant all of Edward's children were illegitimate. And just like that, the entire royal lineage of the Woodvilles was legally erased. The two princes disappeared shortly thereafter. Their fate remains one of the most enduring mysteries in English history. But many believe Richard ordered their deaths. He took the crown for himself as Richard III, Elizabeth Woodville, the woman who had once defied a king and become queen against all odds, was left powerless. She fled into sanctuary with her remaining children, though she later allied with Henry, Tudor, future Henry VII, to defeat Richard. The damage had been done. Edward's scandalous marriage, once a story of forbidden love, had brought down his dynasty. His sons were gone. His wife died in quiet obscurity in 1492. The Plantagenet line was extinguished, and the Tudors rose in its place. But the story of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville remains one of the most powerful royal scandals of the medieval age, not just because it broke the rules, but because it redefined them. It was a love match that defied political strategy, a queen from humble origins who changed the court forever, a family that rose from the fringes of nobility to the very center of power and fell just as fast. Their scandal was not one of secret affairs or illicit children. It was one of choice, of love over politics, and in the world of medieval monarchy, that was the most dangerous scandal of all. It was the spring of 1476 when the Italian city of Milan was consumed not with the usual murmurs of trade or the clang of forges, but with rumors so scandalous, so unthinkable, they brought whispers even into the dark recesses of the cathedral. In the shadows of towering marble walls, nobles exchanged careful glances and hushed voices. The Duke of Milan, Galeazzo Maria Sforza, was dead, murdered brutally in the Basilica of Santo Stefano, and no one was surprised, because if ever there was a ruler destined to meet such an end, it was Galeazzo Sforza, a man whose reign was soaked in excess, cruelty, and scandal. He was a Renaissance prince who bore none of the grace the term implies. He was brilliant, yes, and bold, but also vicious, lecherous, and utterly without shame in his pursuit of power and pleasure. At the core of his infamy was a web of sexual obsession, manipulation, and public degradation unmatched even in the sin-stained courts of 15th century Italy. Galeazzo was the illegitimate son of Francesco Sforza, a condottiero who seized Milan through military cunning and sheer will. But while Francesco ruled with pragmatism and political finesse, Galeazzo indulged in a very different appetite: control through fear and the flesh. From the moment he took power in 1466, Galeazzo turned the ducal palace into something more akin to a theater of lust and cruelty than a center of statecraft. He surrounded himself with musicians, jesters, artists, and lovers. Many of them were women, forced into his bed through intimidation or deceit. Others were the wives and daughters of Milanese nobles, taken not in passion, but as proof of his dominance. His public affairs were not just tolerated, they were flaunted. He commissioned portraits of his mistresses, paraded them in jewels and gowns through the streets of Milan, and forced courtly women to bow to them. His queen, Bona of Savoy, a noble and intelligent woman, was humiliated again and again, but she remained silent, knowing that any opposition could mean exile, or worse. Galazzo's most scandalous liaison, however, wasn't merely about lust. It was about danger, because the woman at the heart of the storm wasn't just a mistress. She was part of a conspiracy. Lucia Marliani was a noblewoman of Milan, known for her sharp wit and striking beauty. She became Galeazzo's most favored lover, and he made no secret of it. Lucia was given rooms in the ducal palace, titles, estates. Her family, once middling, suddenly rose to power, but behind the closed doors of her apartments, something else stirred. Lucia began to fear the man she once admired. Galazzo was growing more erratic. His violence, not only against rivals but against the women around him, was increasing. Servants spoke of screams echoing from behind locked doors, of bruises hidden beneath silk gowns, and then came the whispers of poison. Several rivals of Lucia, including former lovers of the Duke, began dying mysteriously. Illness would strike quickly: vomiting, fever, death within days. No one dared accuse the Duke outright, but many believed he was eliminating obstacles to Lucia's rise. Whether she orchestrated it or was merely the favored pawn, no one knew. But what they did know was this: Milan was growing restless. The city's nobles had long tolerated Galeazzo's tyranny out of fear, but fear can turn to rage, especially when your wives and daughters are no longer safe, especially when your wealth is taxed to support the Duke's endless luxuries, his fountains of wine, his obsessions. And so, In December of 1476, three young Milanese men, Carlo Visconti, Girolamo Olgiati, and Giovanni Andrea Lampugnani, conspired to end the scandal, the suffering, and the rule of the Sforza tyrant. They were not outsiders. They were members of noble families, once allies of the Sforza regime. But something had shifted. Perhaps it was honor. Perhaps it was personal vengeance. Perhaps it was simply that Galazzo had made too many enemies. The morning of December 26th, as the Duke walked into the basilica for Mass, surrounded by guards and courtiers, the assassins struck. In a coordinated attack, they stabbed Galazzo repeatedly, so savagely, so suddenly, that even the Duke's guards were stunned into silence. He died in a pool of blood on the cold marble floor. Lucia Marliani fled. Bona of Savoy, his queen, took control of the court and began a swift and brutal cleanup of the political mess her husband left behind. The assassins were caught within days, tortured, executed. Their bodies hung from the city gates as a warning. But the scandal of Galeazzo, Maria Sforza's rule, did not die with him. It was recorded in diaries, letters, chronicles. His reign became the standard for debauchery, his name synonymous with indulgent tyranny. Machiavelli, decades later, would cite him as a model of what happens when fear outweighs love in a prince's rule, and what of the love, if there was any. Bona of Savoy survived him, and despite the scandal, she protected the Sforza line. Their son, Gian Galeazzo Sforza, inherited the duchy at just 7 years old, but the true power went to Ludovico il Moro, Galeazzo's brother, who would later become infamous himself through yet more betrayal and yet more scandal. The legacy of Galeazzo Sforza was never about governance. It was about desire without boundary. A man who saw women not as companions, but conquests, who mistook fear for loyalty, and who thought power gave him the right to anything. In a sense, his death was not just a political act, it was a form of justice, perhaps even a medieval short a Me Too moment, centuries ahead of its time, because behind the grandeur of his court, the velvet and the music, was a man who had turned love into a weapon, and the court of Milan into a stage of humiliation and indulgence. When the bells tolled for the Duke of Milan, they rang not just for a murdered prince, but for a reign built on scandal, crumbled at last. In the waning years of the 12th century, beneath the soaring arches of Gothic cathedrals and the solemn chants of Latin prayers, one king dared to let passion roar louder than piety. His name was Philip II of France, Philip Augustus, a monarch who forged an empire, defied emperors, and went to war with Richard the Lionheart. But beneath the crown and the crusades lay a story of scandal so humiliating it shook the pillars of the French monarchy. This is the tale of Philip and Ingeborg, the queen he married, rejected, and tried to erase. Philip was a clever and calculating ruler. Crowned at just 15, he soon proved himself a master of politics and military tactics. He expanded French royal power dramatically, reclaimed land from the English, and turned the Capetian dynasty into a true monarchy. But his love life, that was an entirely different battlefield. In 1193, Philip made what seemed to be a shrewd political move. He married Ingeborg of Denmark, the sister of King Canute VI. The Danes were powerful allies, and Philip needed them to strengthen his position against England and the Holy Roman Empire. The marriage took place with all the usual medieval grandeur: mass, music, feasting, and then, almost immediately, after the wedding night, disaster. Philip, to everyone's astonishment, announced that he could not live with Ingeborg. He claimed she was physically repulsive, possibly even cursed. The next day, he demanded an annulment on the grounds of non-consummation and spiritual impurity. The court was stunned. Ingeborg was young, healthy, and by most accounts, quite beautiful. More importantly, she was now Queen of France, and the king's sudden rejection of her wasn't just cruel, it was politically dangerous. Denmark was insulted. The Pope was alarmed. The French nobles were confused. Ingeborg, humiliated but defiant, refused to go quietly. She insisted the Asada marriage was valid and that Philip had consummated it. She would not accept annulment. She wrote letters to the Pope, appealing for help, and she was right to do so. The Church took marriage very seriously, especially royal ones. If Philip could discard a queen on a whim, what did that say about the sanctity of marriage? But Philip was relentless. He held a council of bishops to annul the union, citing false claims of consanguinity, that they were too closely related. The bishops, conveniently loyal to the crown, agreed. Ingeborg was locked away in a convent, isolated, watched. She wasn't even allowed to speak her native language. Still, she fought. She wrote again to Rome. This time, Pope Celestine III responded. With anger, the Pope declared the annulment invalid. Ingeborg was, and remained, Queen of France in the eyes of the Church. Philip was ordered to take her back. He refused. Instead, in 1196, Philip married again, this time to Agnes of Marania, a beautiful young noblewoman from what is now Slovenia. She was elegant, popular, and fertile. Philip loved her openly and passionately. He paraded her through Paris as his queen, even though the Church considered the marriage bigamy. Ingeborg, meanwhile, remained a prisoner in all but name. Her treatment was abysmal. She was moved from convent to fortress, her letters censored, her access to the outside world tightly controlled. Still, she remained resolute, and Rome continued to press for justice. The new pope, Innocent III, arguably the most powerful pope of the Middle Ages, was less patient than his predecessor. When diplomacy failed, he wielded the Church's most fearsome weapon, interdict. In 1199, he placed France under religious lockdown. Churches were closed, bells silenced, marriages forbidden. The dead could not be buried in consecrated ground. It was a spiritual siege on an entire kingdom. The pressure worked. France revolted, not with swords, but with desperation. The nobles begged the king to obey the church. The common people feared damnation. Philip, cornered at last, agreed in 1200 to abandon Agnes and reinstate Ingeborg as queen. But it was all a show. He brought Ingeborg back to court, yes, but gave her no real power, no affection, and no position. She was a puppet queen, kept in luxury but ignored. Agnes though dismissed from court, continued to be Philip's true partner in private. Their love lasted until Agnes died in 1201 during childbirth. It was only then, after 8 long years of humiliation and isolation, that Philip began to truly accept Ingeborg as queen. Why did he hate her so much? Why reject her so violently? Some historians speculate that it was sexual. Their wedding night was a disaster. Perhaps Philip found her physically repellent or suffered from impotence that he blamed on her. Others suggest political betrayal, that Philip had expected more support from Denmark and lashed out when it didn't come. There's also the darker possibility that he was simply cruel, that Ingeborg was caught in a storm of power and male ego. Whatever the cause, the scandal was monumental. For a medieval king to be so publicly rebuked by the Pope, to live openly in sin while his legitimate wife languished in captivity, that was more than a royal affair. It was a theological crisis. And Ingeborg? She endured it all. She outlived Philip by 14 years. When he died in 1223, she was finally fully restored. She lived the rest of her days in quiet dignity, donating to churches, supporting monasteries, and maintaining her royal title. Her legacy is one of quiet resistance, of dignity in the face of betrayal. She never gave up her title, never stopped fighting for recognition, and never allowed the church or the crown to erase her. As for Philip, history remembers him as a great king, military genius, administrative, reformer, builder of France's future. But behind those victories lies a scandal he could never quite shake. A queen cast aside like refuse, a mistress paraded like a trophy, a pope enraged, and a country brought to its knees, not by war, but by love gone wrong. The English court of the 14th century was no stranger to whispers. It had weathered the reckless passions of Henry II, the foreign queens of John, and the blood-stained drama of Edward the Serpent. But nothing, not the Crusades, not baronial wars, prepared the nobility for the shadow that descended during the reign of Edward II. His was not a scandal of fleeting affairs or mere infidelity. It was a love story that defied the rules of crown, church, and nature, one that ended in rebellion, imprisonment, and perhaps even a murder by red-hot poker. At the heart of it all was a man named Piers Gaveston. Edward II, born in 1284, was the son of the iron-willed Edward I, known as Hammer of the Scots. His father was a warrior king, stern, towering, feared. Edward II, by contrast, was softer, more poetic than political. He loved music, pageantry, and the company of handsome men. He loathed war and often shirked the duties of kingship for time in the countryside or at private feasts. When Edward I died in 1307, the court breathed uneasily. Edward II had already caused concern, most notably for his intense and inexplicable devotion to Gaveston. Piers Gaveston was the son of a minor Gascon knight, a man of little fortune or noble standing. But he was everything Edward desired: charming, witty, bold, and breathtakingly attractive. The two had met when Edward was still a prince, and from that moment they were inseparable. To call Gaveston merely a favorite is to understate the nature of their bond. Edward lavished him with gifts, lands, titles, a noble marriage, and eventually the title of Earl of Cornwall, typically reserved for royal blood. It was unheard of, scandalous. The barons seethed, not just because Gaveston was of low birth, but because he held sway over the king like no one else. He mocked the nobility openly, calling them crude nicknames and ridiculing them at court. His arrogance was protected by Edward's favor, and that made him untouchable, or so they thought. In 1308, Edward married Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV. The marriage was strategic, a powerful alliance between England and France. Isabella was just 12, but already politically astute. She expected to be queen. Instead, she arrived in England to find the king more devoted to another. At the coronation, Gaveston wore robes of purple and pearls, more splendid than the king himself. It was he, not Isabella, who dominated the ceremonies. The scandal was immediate. Chroniclers would later say that Isabella was mocked before all of England. The French were outraged. The English nobles were humiliated. Parliament acted swiftly. In 1308, Gaveston was exiled by force. Edward was crushed, but he wasn't finished. By 1309, he had secured Gaveston's return, defying Parliament, angering the barons, and setting in motion a chain of events that would tear his kingdom apart. The nobles, led by powerful men like Thomas of Lancaster, saw Gaveston's continued presence not just as an insult, but as a threat to the balance of power. They issued the Ordinances of 1311, demanding reforms, including Gaveston's permanent exile. This time, Edward had no choice but to agree. But once again, he defied them. Gaveston returned in secret. It was the final straw. In 1312, a group of nobles captured Gaveston. No trial, no negotiation. He was taken to Blacklow Hill near Warwick and executed, beheaded like a common criminal. Edward was inconsolable. He wore mourning for months. Some sources suggest he kept Gaveston's embalmed body for weeks before allowing burial. But the scandal didn't die with Gaveston. In some ways, it had just begun. Isabella, now a teenager, was growing into her role and into her fury. For years, she endured neglect. Though she bore Edward 4 children, including the future Edward III, she remained sidelined. Her husband's attention drifted from Gaveston to new favorites. The Despencer family, especially Hugh, Despencer the younger. Despencer, like Gaveston, was ambitious, cruel, and brazen. But he was also more dangerous. He manipulated royal policy, punished rivals, and confiscated land through legal trickery and intimidation. With him, Edward became even more autocratic, and the court grew more divided than ever. Isabella had had enough. In 1325, under the pretext of a diplomatic mission to France, she left England. With her went her son, the heir to the throne. But what she did next stunned all of Europe. She refused to return. Instead, she allied herself with an English exile, Roger Mortimer, a charismatic lord with a vendetta against the Despensers. Mortimer had escaped from the Tower of London in a daring nighttime escape. Now, in France, he and Isabella became lovers. Their passion was undeniable. Chroniclers noted that they lived not as prince and princess, but as man and wife. Together, they plotted the ultimate revenge. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer returned to England at the head of an army. Towns and nobles rallied to them. The Despensers were hunted down. Hugh, Despenser the Elder, was hanged and beheaded. His son, Edward's beloved, was tried for treason, castrated, and hanged in the most brutal public execution of the age. And Edward, he fled, captured, imprisoned, and ultimately forced to abdicate. In 1327, his 14-year-old son was crowned king. Edward III, the deposed king, was placed in increasingly remote and harsh captivity, and then he vanished, or rather, he died. The official record claimed he died of natural causes, but whispers said otherwise. According to one of the most infamous medieval rumors, Edward II was murdered at Berkeley Castle. The tale, recorded decades later, but believed widely at the time, said that assassins inserted a red-hot poker into his rectum, killing him in a way meant to leave no visible wounds, and symbolically punishing him for his unnatural love. Modern historians debate the truth of the story. Some believe it was propaganda. Others think it reflects real fears of the time, a blend of political vengeance and moral outrage. Either way, the message was clear. The king who loved too wrongly, ruled too poorly, and defied too boldly had met a punishment both grotesque and poetic. Yet even in death, Edward's story lingered. In later years, rumors spread that he had survived, living in exile under an assumed name. Letters surfaced claiming he was seen in Italy in monastic garb. Some modern scholars believe he may indeed have escaped, and that his murder was staged to cover up his secret exile. Whatever the truth, one thing remained certain. Edward II's reign was the most scandal-ridden of medieval England. His love for Gaveston and Despenser turned the court into a battleground. His wife, Isabella, became a rebel queen, a ruler in her own right, and one of the most controversial women in European history. This was not a tale of brief infidelity or passing desire. It was a saga of devotion, betrayal, revenge, and possibly torture, a reminder that love, when it collides with power, can bring down even kings. In the early 15th century, amid the war drums of the Hundred Years' War and the echoing sermons of preachers crying for reform, a different kind of drama unfolded within the walls of Prague Castle. It was a scandal not merely of lust, but of obsession, paranoia, and divine punishment. The king at the center of it, Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, was a man torn between power and delusion, religion and desire, and the man who paid the ultimate price for this royal love affair was thrown from a bridge into legend. Wenceslaus IV, son of Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor, inherited a troubled kingdom and an even more troubled soul. His father had been a titan of European politics, but Wenceslaus, he was anxious, erratic, and frequently drunk. He was known to lock himself in castles for weeks, obsessed with astrology and alchemy, surrounded by court fools and foreign mistresses. One of his most enduring obsessions, however, was a woman, Queen Sophia of Bavaria, his beautiful, devout, and some say, long-suffering wife. But the real scandal didn't lie in his love for Sophia. It lay in his suspicion that someone else loved her too. That man was John of Nepomuk, a priest, royal confessor, and trusted adviser. At first, he and Wenceslaus worked in harmony. John was learned, eloquent, and fiercely loyal to the church. He mediated disputes, advised on court policy, and became close to Queen Sophia as her spiritual counselor. And that, allegedly, is where the trouble began. Wenceslaus, increasingly paranoid and unstable, began to suspect that something more was happening between his wife and her confessor. Sophia spent more and more time with John. Their conversations were private, their bond unshakable. Some chroniclers suggested that Wenceslaus's jealousy bordered on madness. He became convinced that Sophia had confessed intimate, even sinful, secrets to John, possibly an affair, possibly political dissent. But John refused to reveal anything. As a priest, he was bound by the seal of confession, an inviolable law of the church. Whatever the queen said to him, he would take to his grave. Wenceslaus didn't take no for an answer. He summoned John to court and demanded the truth. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. Each time, John remained silent, and each time Wenceslaus grew more enraged. According to the most vivid accounts, the king had John arrested and tortured. He was starved, beaten, racked, and still he said nothing. When the king realized he couldn't break him, he ordered the priest executed. The method, quiet and symbolic. On a cold night in 1393, John of Nepomuk was bound, gagged, and thrown from the Charles Bridge into the Vltava River. His body was discovered days later downstream. The court, already whispering of the king's madness, fell into silence. Sophia was devastated, and the people began to speak of martyrdom. But here, the scandal deepens, because not all historians agree on the reason for John's death. Some say it wasn't about Sophia at all, but about politics. John, in his role as vicar general, had sided with the Archbishop of Prague in a dispute over church appointments, directly defying the king's authority. Others say he was protecting the Pope's interests against Wenceslaus, who was increasingly erratic and hostile toward church influence. So was John killed for his loyalty to the Queen, or his loyalty to Rome, or was it both? What cannot be denied is the effect his death had. The image of a confessor, murdered for keeping a queen's secrets, became irresistible to later storytellers. By the 17th century, John of Nepomuk was canonized as a saint, the martyr of the confessional. Statues of him began appearing on bridges throughout Europe, always showing him with a halo of 5 stars, said to have appeared over the river the night he died. As for Queen Sophia, her fate was equally tragic. After John's death, she withdrew from court life, increasingly isolated from her husband. She lived under a cloud of suspicion for years, her reputation questioned, her privacy shattered, and Wenceslaus, his rule unraveled. Already unpopular for his inaction during the early stages of religious reform, especially during the rise of Jan Hus, he was seen as a weak, tyrannical drunk who had killed a priest over jealousy. He was imprisoned by the nobility twice, deposed as king of the Romans, and his kingdom fractured by civil war. The affair, if it was even that, between Sophia and John became more powerful in death than it ever could have been in life. It haunted Bohemian politics for decades, fanned the flames of religious dissent, and helped catalyze a movement that would eventually explode into the Hussite Wars, a bloody, decades-long rebellion that prefigured the Protestant Reformation by more than a century. It is rare for a single act of royal paranoia to ripple so far through history, but the story of Wenceslaus, Sophia, and the silent priest became more than gossip. It became myth, legend, prophecy, and perhaps that's the real scandal. Not what happened behind closed doors, but what the world believed about it. A jealous king, a silent priest, a queen whose confessions may have cost a man his life, and a body thrown from a bridge into sainthood. By the twilight of the medieval age, royal scandals had become a genre unto themselves, acted out not only on battlefields and in court chambers, but in bedrooms, cloisters, and confessionals. The curtain on our saga now draws to a final, smoldering act, a scandal so hidden, so politically explosive, that for centuries it was buried beneath layers of diplomacy, dynastic marriage, and carefully crafted myths. This is the story of Charles VII of France and his shadow queen, Agnès Sorel. Charles VII ruled a broken France in the early 15th century. The Hundred Years' War had splintered the kingdom. The English occupied vast regions of the north. The people starved. His own father, Charles VI, had been mentally unwell for much of his reign, believing himself made of glass and unfit to rule, and the French crown had nearly slipped into oblivion. And then came Joan of Arc, the peasant girl from Domremy, with her visions and courage, lifted Charles from despair. Thanks to her military inspiration, Charles was crowned King of France at Reims in 1429, reclaiming legitimacy for the French monarchy. But even after Joan's martyrdom and Charles's rise, one thing remained unchanged. The king himself was indecisive, melancholic, and withdrawn, until one day a woman walked into court and changed everything. Her name was Agnès Sorel. She was not royalty, not even nobility in the high sense. Born to a minor noble family in Touraine, she arrived at court as a maid of honor to Charles's queen, Marie of Anjou. But she did not stay in the background for long. Agnès was radiant, elegant, witty, with eyes that seemed to pierce through veils of decorum. Her beauty was such that chroniclers described her as a pearl among women. Soon, she caught the eye of Charles, and the king, long buried under the weight of war and doubt, came alive. Agnès was not the first royal mistress in France, but she was the first to be openly recognized as such. She had a title, she had lands, she had a residence, she had influence, and, most scandalously, she appeared at court in fashions no one had dared before. She wore sheer fabrics that revealed her shoulders and chest, sometimes with one breast left provocatively bare, framed in velvet or silk. This was no accident. It was deliberate provocation. Agnes understood power, and she wielded it with stunning effect. Suddenly, the king was decisive again, active in affairs of state, rejuvenated. Historians still debate how much political influence Agnes truly wielded. But many agree Charles's sudden confidence during the final years of the Hundred Years' War, leading to the French reconquest of much territory, coincided directly with her rise. But the court was divided. To the common people, she was a sorceress or worse, a corrupting influence sent by the devil himself. To others, she was the savior of the French monarchy, pulling Charles from his lethargy. To Queen Marie, she was an open insult, a mistress who did not hide in shadow, but paraded before the court like a second queen. Then, in 1450, something happened that shook even her enemies. Agnes, still in her 20s, died suddenly. The official explanation was dysentery, but suspicions blossomed instantly. Some whispered poison, others blamed the queen. A few pointed fingers at the powerful minister Jacques Coeur, whom Agnes had supported. Even Charles, devastated, ordered an investigation, highly unusual for the death of a mistress. Decades later, a medical examination of her remains revealed high levels of mercury. While mercury was sometimes used for cosmetics or medicinal treatments, the levels were suspicious, far too high for accident. Had Agnes Sorel been murdered? If so, by whom? By a jealous queen, angry at the mistress who had eclipsed her? By political rivals who feared her influence over the king? Or had her death simply been the cost of being the first royal mistress who dared to hold power in the open? Whatever the truth, Agnes's legacy was irreversible. She changed the French monarchy, not just with her beauty, but with her political presence. She legitimized the role of royal mistresses for generations to come. Kings would no longer hide their lovers in shame. They would elevate them, reward them, even build chateaux for them. Her story also altered how power could be performed. It could come not only from swords, crowns, and birthright, but from presence, grace, and seduction. It is a truth that has echoed through royal courts ever since. As the medieval age faded and the Renaissance dawned, Europe would continue to witness royal scandals, love affairs, and betrayals. But never again would they possess quite the same raw, unchecked volatility as in those brutal, glorious, blood-soaked centuries of old. Here, now, our journey ends. We've traveled through the torch-lit halls of English castles, through the foggy banks of the Vltava and the lavender fields of France, unearthing forbidden letters, whispered confessions, and passions that toppled crowns. We've met queens who wielded knives behind their smiles, and kings who risked empires for a kiss in the dark. These weren't just rulers. They were lovers, liars, schemers, and human beings. And their love affairs? They weren't side notes in history. They were the history. Because in the end, even those crowned by God could not escape the pull of forbidden love, nor could they silence the stories that followed. So, if you've stayed with us through every passion and peril, every sword and secret kiss, thank you. If you found yourself leaning closer, wondering what truly happened behind those high stone walls, we hope you've felt the same electric curiosity that has kept historians and romantics awake for centuries. Don't forget to follow us if you'd like more stories that history tried to bury, but memory refused to forget. Leave a like if you enjoyed this series and subscribe so you won't miss what we uncover next. Because history doesn't just live in books, it breathes through scandals, and it remembers love. Until next time, stay curious and beware the secrets behind the crown.